But anyway, I've published this a couple of times. I've published it recently in a book called Brain Inflammation. But again, it's from chapter 5 of the big book here. So let's talk about how to approach this topic. So I just made this up the other day. This might be new. I don't know if you have this in your notes. But these questions are, what is it? When does it happen? And why does it keep happening? Assuming that it's real, how does it continue? And then how do we treat it? So I think those are reasonable questions. First question is it real? The answer, of course, is yes, it's very real. So what I call brain inflammation, because it's easy to understand, is also called neuroinflammation, as you just saw in my article. We see this in patients who have brain injury, any type of illness or infection or vaccination or immune response. So let's talk about that. So one of the things that I want everybody to understand is that every time you're working with a patient who has like systemic inflammation, rheumatoid arthritis, lupus, but also diabetes, anytime you're working with a patient who has any type of inflammation, they're also experiencing brain inflammation. So people can have brain inflammation without systemic inflammation, but anybody who has systemic inflammation also has brain inflammation. And that also happens when people are sick. That's why you see change in behavior when people are sick. It's called sickness behavior. And so what is sickness behavior? Fatigue, depression, change in sleep, and usually either eating more or eating less. So change in sleep and change in eating behavior. People also, when they're sick, tend to become unsocial, so they want to be alone. They typically have no interest in fun activities or sexual pursuits. But definitely fatigue, depression, maybe a little bit of an anxiety. So that's called sickness behavior, and it's a reflection of brain inflammation. And the other thing that I want to mention, so I've already said that people who have systemic inflammation have brain inflammation. The same thing is true when people have any type of infection. They have systemic inflammation, it changes brain behavior, it changes brain function. We call that sickness behavior. But another point that I want to make, based on at least 2 studies that have been published, very basic studies, is that when people get vaccinated, they also have brain inflammation. Now, for some people, they get vaccinated and they just feel sick for a few days, and then they're fine afterwards. But I'm sure you've heard of people who get vaccinated and they develop an acute or chronic encephalitis. Their brain is inflamed for weeks, months, or years, right? Everybody's heard of that? Well, I think what we're talking about right now actually helps to explain that phenomenon. So, for example, you all heard of the controversy connecting vaccinations with autism, right? I think that that association is very difficult to understand unless we understand brain inflammation. So we'll talk about that more. It's actually not a major point, but it's an important point. So we'll talk about a group of cells in the brain called microglia and glial cells. It ultimately becomes a self-perpetuating cycle. So for example, if people have brain injury when they're kids, like in their teens, let's say somebody gets in a car accident when they're 20 years old and they have a brain injury. 40 years later, they're more likely to develop Alzheimer's disease, right? The data on that's quite clear. So why would that be? you know, because a lot of times we're taught that Alzheimer's is like a genetic disease, it kind of runs in the family, something like that. Well, if that's true, then why would head injury increase the risk of mild head injury? Why would head injury increase the risk of Alzheimer's? We're going to go through this page at the end as well, so I don't have to cover everything right now. So we're going to talk about this picture quite a bit as we go through. Like this is the main take-home message of today. This one page, but we'll go through that kind of piece by piece. I published another short article on this topic last year related to fibromyalgia. It's available online for free if you have interest. So let's just look at some numbers related to migraine and fibromyalgia. Migraine affects approximately 13% of the international population. Fibromyalgia affects about 2% of the population. That's actually a lot of people, you know. So if you understand how to treat these conditions, I assume that most of you are in clinical practice, either as doctors or nutritionists. So this is a lot of people. I mean, you could basically run your practice only seeing these conditions. And we also see some associations with other conditions, not only fibromyalgia and migraine, but also chronic fatigue syndrome, irritable bowel syndrome, multiple chemical sensitivity, and interstitial cystitis, which is another variant of irritable bowel syndrome. All right, so this is a great diagram here. So let's talk about central sensitization, right? So the drug companies want you to believe that chronic pain is a result of central sensitization. Okay? That's what gets published in the research. That's what gets published in the review articles, that chronic pain is a result of central sensitization. And in my opinion, that is correct. I agree with it. The difference is that they say that central sensitization has no cause, no known cause, and I completely disagree with that. So we're starting from the same idea that chronic pain is caused by central sensitization. And chronic pain in this context means fibromyalgia, migraine headaches, the pain of lupus or rheumatoid arthritis, for example, psoriasis. So this covers a lot of different conditions. I think we all agree, we people who look at this stuff in the medical research, I think we all agree that these patients have central sensitization. The difference is, I think we should treat this with nutrition, and they think you should treat this with drugs. The difference is that my nutrition protocol works better than their drugs. So I think it's better. So let's talk about central sensitization. First of all, no one can make sense of the term central sensitization, right? There's no inherent logic in that phrase other than it just means people have a brain that's sensitive to pain. But you can't do anything about it, right? There's no action. And I'm sure most of you, how many of you are familiar with Noam Chomsky? Right? I mean, you got to know what time it is. You have to know Noam Chomsky's work. And you can watch a video that he produced called Manufacturing Consent. It's free online. I don't know if it's in French, but it probably is. France obviously is famous for having a lot of intellectuals. So, but you also have to know somebody else's name, George Orwell, right? So, one of the things that George Orwell talked about is he talks about two different types of language. He talks about language that's actually useful, and he talks about language that, in his words, quote, limits the range of thought, unquote. So in my opinion, central sensitization is a term that limits the range of thought because you can't do anything about it. There's no action you can take with it. However, if we say, instead of saying central sensitization, if we say brain inflammation, then you have some understanding of what we can do with it, right? Because you have some understanding of what causes inflammation, you have some understanding of what treats inflammation. It's an actionable term, much more so than central sensitization. Central sensitization, like, what do you do with that? Like, how do you feel that phrase, right? It makes me want to lay down because I can't do anything with it, right? But if somebody says brain inflammation, then I can say, well, I have some ideas. I can do something with that. So my point is that brain inflammation and central sensitization are the same thing. And if we understand it that way, then we can take some action. So I'm about to explain to you brain inflammation, migraine headaches, fibromyalgia, chronic pain, depression, and some anxiety. It's all right here. So this is not my diagram. This was published in a journal called Frontiers in Neuroscience in 2013. It's an open access, it's a free article, so I took the liberty of using their diagram along with providing them appropriate credit. So, the first thing you have to understand is that your brain contains, let's say, 3 major populations of cells, right? Typically, we've thought of the brain as being neurons, like nerve cells, right, that just talk to each other. And that's actually, of course, only part of the picture. The other half of the brain, let's say, are these groups of cells that provide support, provide structure, provide repair after damage, provide protection, and sometimes make things worse. And generally speaking, those are called glial cells. So when we talk about the glia, we're talking about all the cells in the brain that are not neurons. And that's where the action is, right? A modern understanding of chronic pain, a modern understanding of psychosis, a modern understanding of depression, migraine headaches, etc., has to include understanding about glia. And these are things we didn't know, 5 or 10 years ago. Like, for example, I graduated from medical school in 2010, and I don't think we ever had a lecture on glia, what glia are, what glia do. We talked about the cells, but we didn't talk about what they actually do in the real world. And maybe it wasn't known then, I don't know. But let's talk about what we know now. So we're going to talk about 3 different types of cells in the brain, right? Because it's not just neurons, it's other cells as well. So here's your neuron here. This is your nerve cell of the brain over here. And this is a cell obviously called microglia or microglia, however you want to pronounce it. So this is what's called the resident immune cell of your brain. So your brain has its own immune system, and this is mostly it. It's these microglial cells. So these cells respond to damage, infection, inflammation. In this case, we're going to say that an inflammatory trigger activates this cell. So usually this cell is dormant or sleeping, but we can wake it up through some type of inflammatory or traumatic event. So we're going to call that microglial activation. So it's kind of like you in the morning when you're asleep, and then you have 3 cups of coffee. Now you're activated. You're ready to do something, change something, damage something, perhaps make something better. So that's a pretty good analogy. So here's inflammation causes microglial activation. When the microglia, the immune cells, when